Gravel logging road above a mill town in the British Columbia interior, October 1957. Friday, 6:40 in the evening. The corporal at the two-man RCMP detachment, 7 years at this posting, a service record of the type documented across RCMP divisional histories for interior resource detachments in this decade, was driving the upper road before dark, and he was driving it now, for a reason the duty roster did not contain. It was payday at the mill. Payday Friday, in a town of 1,900 people, built around one sawmill, had a shape, and 7 years had taught him the shape. The shift whistle, the pay window, the beer parlor filling by 7, the camp trucks coming down from the bush operations before the light went. None of that had happened yet. He was on the upper road because of the rain. 3 days of October rain, and the culvert at the 8-mile creek crossing carried it badly. The road surface above the culvert went soft before anything showed from a moving vehicle. He knew this the way he knew the payday sequence, not from a manual, not from a bulletin, but from 7 autumns of the same road doing the same thing. If a loaded camp truck came down that grade tonight in the dark, on a softened crossing, 40 minutes from town, the detachment would be the only institution in the valley that could have known in advance. So he was looking at the crossing while there was still light to read it by. Here is the first question this road raises. 7 years earlier, this same road, this same town, this same payday Friday belonged to a different police force entirely. A force that had existed for 92 years and then, in the space of a single summer, stopped existing. What force was that? And what happened in August 1950 that put a corporal of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on a BC logging road at all? The force was the British Columbia Provincial Police, formed in 1858, 9 years before Canada existed, one of the oldest police organizations in North America. It had policed the gold camps, the mining districts, and the interior valleys for 92 years. Then, in the summer of 1950, after negotiations conducted at remarkable speed between Victoria and Ottawa, the province dissolved it. On the changeover date in August 1950, 492 provincial constables went to bed as one force and woke up as members of the RCMP's new E Division, a division whose policing area exceeded 360,000 square miles. The provincial force left one visible legacy on every road in this story: its black patrol cars with white doors, a marking scheme the RCMP adopted across the country. The institution the corporal belonged to in 1957 was therefore new to the valley in one sense and old in another. The detachment building was the same, some of the men were the same men in different uniforms, and the road knowledge had transferred the only way it could, inside the officers who carried it. What the institution provided was thin by design: a 2-man detachment, a car, a radio that died in the valley bottoms, and a district headquarters hours away. Everything else, the culvert, the payday shape, the camp roads, the posting had to grow in the officer himself. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. What did 7 years above one mill town give a corporal about 40 miles of logging road in October, rain that no GPS and no centralized dispatch has ever been designed to hold? And if you served in the RCMP or provincial police in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did you or your family serve at a resource town detachment in BC or Northern Ontario between 1940 and 1970? And which road, which camp, which payday Friday do you still know by name? Next on this channel, the RCMP dog sled patrols of the Northwest Territories and the 1910-11 Lost Patrol, which documented what happens when the territory knowledge is not in the sled. Back on the grid road. So the institution was thin, and the territory was not. What, exactly, did 7 years at one interior posting build in an officer? And what did the same question look like 2,000 miles east, in the mining country of Northern Ontario, where the police force on the ground had never been the RCMP at all? Territory knowledge at a resource town posting was not one thing. It was a layered inventory, and it was built in a specific order. The first layer was the roads, and interior roads were not prairie roads. A prairie grid road drifted. An interior logging road did everything. It washed out in October, iced at elevation in November, while the valley bottom stayed bare, broke up from beneath in the spring thaw, so that a surface that looked solid would take a car's front axle down to the frame. RCMP divisional histories for interior detachments in this period describe the same operational fact again and again. The officer's effective territory was defined not by the map, but by what he knew about which road was passable in which month. The second layer was the geography of work. The camps moved. A logging operation that was 40 men at the 12-mile in June was closed by Christmas and reopened somewhere else in a different drainage by spring. The mines were fixed, but their shifts were not. Knowing the territory meant knowing, in any given week, where the people in it actually were, which bunkhouses were full, which cook was feeding how many, which road would carry traffic at shift change. The third layer was time itself. Payday cycles, hunting season, breakup, freeze-up, the mill's maintenance shutdown. Each cycle changed what a call meant. A report of a man missing meant one thing in July, and a different, sharper thing in the first week of real cold. None of this was recorded anywhere. The detachment files held occurrences. They did not hold the calendar in the corporal's head. So consider the eastern version of the same question. In northern Ontario, the police force that grew up with the mining camps was older than most people assume, and it was born, directly, from ore. Who policed Cobalt, Timmins, and the Sudbury country, and where did that force come from? Here the resource town posting diverged from the prairie posting, and the divergence matters. The prairie corporal built his knowledge around fixed families, the same farms, the same names, 14 calls to the same section over 11 years. The resource town officer could not, because a large part of his population would not hold still. Published histories of BC Interior and Northern Ontario resource communities in this period document workforces that turned over constantly, single men following the camps, seasonal crews arriving for the cut and leaving at breakup, miners moving between properties as prices moved. So the posted officer built a different kind of knowledge, not a knowledge of persons so much as a knowledge of patterns. He learned what a camp of 40 strangers looked like when it was settled, and what it looked like when something was working on it. He learned the rhythm of the beer parlor on an ordinary Friday well enough to feel the difference on a Friday that was not ordinary. He learned which cook, which foreman, which hotel keeper in a transient town functioned as the fixed points, the people who stayed, who knew the flow-through population, and who would tell the detachment what the detachment could not observe. In a town where half the faces changed every season, the officer's real informants were the town's own permanent minority, and the relationship with them was the operational core of the posting. And he learned the roads out, because a territory of strangers was also a territory people left quickly, and the officer who knew that only 2 roads carried out of the valley, and what condition each was in tonight, held information that no district office possessed. What, then, did this thin blue presence actually mean to a town of 1900 that saw no other institution of the state from one month to the next? 2,000 miles east, the answer to who policed the mining country was never the RCMP. Ontario kept its own force, and that force was created by exactly the world this video documents. When silver was struck at Cobalt and then gold at Timmins in the first years of the century, the sudden camps of northern Ontario outran every existing arrangement for keeping order. The province's response, in October 1909, was to establish a permanent, salaried body of constables, the Ontario Provincial Police. And the original structure of the OPP tells you what it was for. Of its first divisional headquarters, one sat at Cobalt in the Silver Country and one at Sudbury in the Nickel Basin. This was a force whose skeleton was laid out along the ore bodies. By the 1940s and 1950s, the OPP presence in the north was a scatter of small detachments, 1 and 2 constables in mill towns and mine towns, responsible for bush roads, lumber camps, highway sections, and townships that a southern division would have called empty. The operational problem was the BC problem in a different landscape. Enormous distances, thin communications, a transient workforce, and a posted officer whose value was what he had learned about his own district. The larger towns, Sudbury itself, Timmins, Kirkland Lake, ran municipal forces for the streets, with the OPP holding everything outside the town line. So a single mine truck driving from the headframe to a bush camp could pass through 2 police jurisdictions in 20 minutes, and the officers on both sides of that line generally knew each other by first name, because the institution was small enough that they had to. Which brings us to the community itself, and to the question of what it was like to police people who knew exactly who you were. In a town built around one mine or one mill, the constable was not an anonymous function. He was a household fact. His car was known, his hours were known, his wife, if he had one at the posting, bought groceries at the same store as everyone else. Oral history collections from resource communities in this era document what that visibility produced, and it produced 2 things at once. The first was a kind of social management that never appeared in any file, the dispute that cooled because the constable stood in a doorway and knew both parties' foreman, the payday trouble that ended as a walk home instead of a charge because the officer knew which bunkhouse a man belonged to and what his record of Fridays actually was. The known officer could calibrate, and calibration was most of the work. The second thing was the complication. The officer who knew everyone was also known by everyone. His judgments were watched, remembered, and compared. Enforcing a liquor seizure against one hotel and not another, in a town where both keepers knew him, was not an administrative act. It was a public statement the town would read closely. Published accounts of small detachment service in this period returned to the same tension. The closeness that made the work possible was the same closeness that made every decision personal. And there was a third dimension, present in nearly every northern posting and absent from the postcard version of this history: the communities at the edge of the patrol map. Indigenous communities in northern Ontario and the BC interior stood in a relationship with these forces that was not the mill town's relationship, because the officer arrived carrying not just his own judgment, but his institution's policies. What were those policies, in these decades, in these regions? That question is not a detour from this subject. It is part of the subject. Document it plainly. In November 1941, roughly 4,000 gold miners struck at Kirkland Lake, in one of the defining labor disputes in Canadian history. Ontario's government sent about 180 provincial police into the town, and the historical record, including the standard scholarly account of the strike, is direct about their function. The OPP were ordered to assist the mining companies in operating with strikebreakers. The miners' families marched. The strike collapsed in February 1942, and the OPP cars on those streets were the same institution as the single constable who knew every camp cook in his district. In British Columbia, the record is harder still. In September 1953, RCMP officers arrested 148 Sons of Freedom Doukhobor adults in the Kootenays and removed 104 of their children to a fenced dormitory at New Denver, a former tuberculosis sanatorium. Over 6 years, through repeated raids that survivors describe as coming at night, roughly 200 children were taken. British Columbia formally apologized and offered compensation decades later, and across both provinces in these same decades, police forces enforced compulsory attendance systems that took Indigenous children to residential schools, an enforcement role documented throughout the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's records. Hold all of it in one frame, because it belongs in one frame. The corporal reading the culvert in October rain, and the officers on the New Denver raids wore the same uniform, drove the same black and white cars, in the same decade, sometimes in the same district. The territory knowledge this channel documents was real. So were the orders. A community's memory of the detachment depended entirely on which face of the institution had arrived at its door. Then, beginning in the 1960s, something started dissolving both faces at once. What was it? The dissolving agent arrived as an improvement, because it was one. Through the 1950s and 1960s, RCMP and OPP records document the steady extension of two-way radio into rural and northern operations. Better sets, repeater coverage pushing into country where a car had simply gone silent when it left town. Before radio reached the valley, the resource town officer had operated the way a ship's captain operated. Everything he might need to know, he needed to know before departure. Which road was open? Which camp was cut off? Who could be reached by which telephone? What a 6-hour absence from all contact required him to carry in the car and in his head. Radio changed the arithmetic. An officer who could be reached could be redirected. An officer who could call for help did not need to be self-sufficient to the same degree. And a district office that could talk to every car began, naturally, to run every car. Highways improved in the same years. The 40-minute logging road became a 25-minute paved road. The town that had needed its own resident detachment could now be covered from the next town over. What radio and pavement did not carry was the content of the posting. The dispatcher who could reach the car did not know the culvert at the 8 Mile, or which cook was the fixed point in a camp of strangers, or what an ordinary Friday sounded like from the sidewalk. That knowledge still lived only in officers, and the institution was about to decide, without ever quite saying so, that it no longer needed to grow that knowledge at all. What did that decision look like on the ground? And what does the 8 Mile crossing look like from a patrol car today? On the ground, the decision looked like closed doors. Through the late 1960s and the 1970s, both the RCMP and the OPP consolidated small detachments into larger district operations. A documented, deliberate restructuring. Short rotations replaced long postings. The two-man Milltown office became one territory among several covered from a regional center, and the officer in the car was, increasingly, an officer the town did not know and who had not been there long enough to know the town. The gains were real, and the institutions counted them. Flexible deployment, lower cost, supervision, consistency. What was not counted, because no ledger existed for it, was the inventory this video has spent 20 minutes describing. The culvert, the payday shape, the fixed points among the strangers, the calendar in the corporal's head. When the last long-posted officers retired, that inventory retired with them, unrecorded, because nobody's job had ever been to ask for it. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more logging roads, more northern detachments, more dog sled crossings, more payday Fridays with a shape the file never held, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What did 7 years above 1 Mill town build that no dispatch console has ever been designed to hold? If you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. Which road, which camp, which Friday does your family still know by name? And next, the Northwest Territories dog patrols and the Lost Patrol of 1910-11. What happened when the knowledge was not in the sled? The Milltown detachment closed in the consolidations. The district car that covers the valley today knows the route from the screen. It gets there. The old upper road still goes soft above the creek in 3 days of October rain. The screen has not changed. The knowledge is somewhere else now.